Hello, I'm Pronago. Welcome to the Echoes Review. This is a campaign that was created by Tipereth in the year of 2009, year of our Lord, Amon, Agay. Now, as this campaign was made for the 2009 Campaign Creations Campaign Contest, I assume that Tipereth is actually aware of a lot of the problems that we observed in the playthrough. I assume that the campaign was just rushed in order to meet the deadline of the contest. But that being said, obviously, there were a lot of problems that we encountered that we shouldn't have encountered that would have been fixed by basic, testing the map longer than, a few times. Just once after, you got it ready for release, quote unquote, if you consider these maps ready for release, which I do not. So evidently, Tipereth did not update the campaign after it was released for the contest, quote-unquote finished, to fix any of the problems, including like the obvious shit like crashing and stuff, as well as like text moving by too fast and any number of the innumerable issues that we found while playing. Now, when it comes to the review itself, obviously I as much as I would like to give him the benefit of the doubt in terms of like, he was rushing to meet a contest deadline, he didn't give any, post-release care to the product, so he... I have to just review what I played, obviously. I can't review some imaginary, bug-free project that I obviously did not play. And so we'll be tackling the review from that perspective, and I'll be starting with the story basically completely separately from the gameplay, because the story itself was evidently Tipereth's main focus when it came to designing Echoes, and we'll be talking about what I felt worked and what mostly what I felt didn't work, and then we'll move on to the gameplay afterwards. So the opener of this campaign was pretty schizophrenic. And what I mean by that is that it didn't really feel grounded. I didn't feel like it was really working to establish the through lines for the campaign. And especially when the campaign, as we find out, jumps around in time a lot, there's really not a whole lot to guide players through the experience. Now, you can say that maybe Tipereth wanted to challenge players and he wanted the players to sort of have to really pay attention to follow along. But there's some really interesting, strange bits about the story. Like, for example, I believe the ending of the 8th mission is actually meant to be like, Rachel walks up to where Captain Fika is and, expecting to find Stephen Kane. And Captain Fika is there to greet her instead, says like, hello, Rachel, or whatever that final word was, and then you get victory. And then I think that's actually supposed to be the last, that's supposed to be the lead up to the first mission. So the last gameplay we get as Rachel is supposed to lead us into where the campaign began. At least that's what I'm expecting. But of course, Rachel's, I assume she died. I assume Fika killed her. That whole scene was completely glossed over, if that is indeed meant to be the case, in the first mission. Because in the first mission, you're playing as Captain Fika, you escape, and, you make it out of Aeolus. And so, there's a lot of problems with the pacing and the presentation, but the opening does really little, basically nothing, to introduce you to any of the grounding themes. You have some elements of the story. You have the fact that it's a UED commander. You have, the proper noun of Captain Fika as a character. You have the Nightmare Zerg, which is incredibly edgy as a title. You have those introduced. And, you have something of an understanding of where this takes place in terms of the story. I think there was some textual shit at the beginning that info dumped and exposited the exact time and date, although I don't really remember too well. And aside from that, you get nothing. And so you have no idea what to expect for the next mission. And of course, the next mission is not a direct continuation. It's 3 to 4 years after that or something. Where you're playing as Rachel for the first time. And that was the mission where we had to go on an Easter egg hunt for doodads. And then after that, we had to fight an infested command center. So just to remind people of what I'm talking about here. You can see very immediately that there is nothing that intrinsically connects the first mission to the second mission, and even the first mission to the third mission. You don't really get a strong connection with the first mission, between that mission and any other mission until probably the 5th or 6th map or something like that, and more directly in the 7th and 8th missions, which are installation missions that are meant to be in the same, all of those 3 maps, 1, 7, and 8, are meant to be in the same location. So there's like more of a direct connection there. And that sort of lends some more credence to my theory anyways, at least in my mind, that map 8 ends where map 1 begins. Or like roughly there. It's like supposed to be the continuation, or like that's supposed to be where one part of the story ends and then the other one picks up off of that. So there's some interesting concepts there. You can say that conceptually some of the ideas that Tipereth had weren't the worst, but evidently his execution was way off the mark. And the fact that I'm still really struggling to understand stuff, I mean, it's not like I'm the most brain dead person you'll find playing campaigns. At least I'd like to hope not. And so when I'm playing through a story, I'm like writing down notes for the review and going back and rewatching the old videos to get some idea of like what the story was actually about. And I still don't really have a core idea, especially from the first mission itself. I feel like that should give you some sort of guiding, sort of theme. Again, it should establish what the campaign is meant to be about. And it gives us a setting, it gives us a place in the setting, it gives us one character who ends up being, I guess, a pretty pivotal character, Captain Fika, and then it gives us the Nightmare Zerg, and it gives us the UED, EIC, whatever. But none of those are immediately, besides, I guess, the Nightmare Zerg, which are sort of present. I guess the UED were present as well in the second mission, but like Rachel being part of the Dominion, she shows up out of nowhere. And it's fine to introduce Rachel in that mission, but to jump ahead immediately for like 3 years into the future or however long it was is immediately like you're creating a very big distance in terms of how the players are going to interpret that story information compared to the previous mission. And so there's immediately a wide gap. And so that's a pretty big problem for me is just the fact that the opening does very little to essentially establish anything that is going to then be referenced as the campaign progresses. And speaking of the characters themselves with Rachel and Fika, I would say that the characters are actually probably the only serviceable part of the entire project, or would be if they were executed a little bit better. I struggle to say that any part of the story is serviceable. I think there's like some concepts that are okay, but the characters are at least consistent for the most part, except Fika has no motive really like, that we know of. He's just acting, malevolent, wants to kill a bunch of people. It's still not really clear why he lured Rachel to where he lured them and why he didn't just reveal himself as Captain Fika to begin with. And at the at the end of the 8th mission, it's revealed that Captain Fika the High Templar was presumably we're meant to expect that the ghost that Kane killed was a hallucination from that tortured High Templar, and then Fika walks in and kills the High Templar and then kills Kane, and that's like the last scene we get before Rachel walks in, and it's a very awkward situation, obviously, because we had to walk for like 10 more minutes. But regardless, then Fika says, "Oh, I've been waiting for you." So I assume that's the real Captain Fika, especially since the first mission was the real Captain Fika, presumably. So I don't know why he didn't just introduce himself as Captain Fika to the UED and they couldn't just all leave or whatever. Like, why did they need to do what they did in the first place? Why did they have to assume that it was Stephen Kane this whole time fighting them? Why couldn't Captain Fika, especially since later on he demonstrates control over the Nightmares in that 9th mission? Like, it really just all falls apart, doesn't it? So yeah, I'm really not 100% sure what Fika's motives are and why he behaves the way he does. It's not so much that the way that he behaves clashes with what I believe his character to be. It's more so that his actions don't have any motivations that we know of that are behind. Like, we know that there must be some motives, because that's how living entities work, is that they have some sort of motivation. But those motives are never divulged to us as players from the perspective, they're never presented to us. So we can't ever really know. But I would say other than that, I mean, obviously Stephen Kane was not really a character. He's more of like a red herring. But I thought Rachel was a fairly consistent character, even though she is pretty one-dimensional. I guess we can get into the specific concepts that I thought were of varying degrees of quality. We'll start with the only one that I thought was strong-ish or serviceable, and that is the UED having contingencies for De Gaulle's defeat. It speaks to a greater scale than this project ultimately ended up serving us. And I like the idea that it sort of ties in with the UED, makes them feel a bit more malevolent, a bit more carefully designed, and as a faction, they feel more fleshed out as a result of what the implications of these like nightmare operations are. You know, what they ended up creating was pretty cringy with the whole nightmare stuff, but the idea that, you know, as a concept, the UED is acting, they're watching De Gaulle fail, watching all of these this task force, this expeditionary force, you know, just get destroyed by the Zerg at the end of the Brood Wars, and they're sitting, you know, sort of the higher ups are observing this, while other shadow operations are still happening in the Koprulu sector with the Zerg, with the Protoss, finding ways to incorporate that into better technology. There's like a line that the UED scientist had in, I think it was the third missions briefing, where he said that you give the Protoss too much credit and humanity far too little. You know, I thought that served to reinforce the idea that the UED are a superior Terran faction to anything we've seen before, and what little modding there was sort of reinforced that as well with the idea of the elite units. Like, I thought that was an interesting concept as a story, you know, not in terms of how it was executed, but as a concept, I thought it was okay. You know, the idea that if you're going to be working within Blizzard's really flawed story, you know, that this is a fine way to work within that. It's a fine concept to build a story around, is that, you know, what are the UED's shadow operations while they are working, while De Gaulle is failing, what else are the UED doing in the Koprulu sector, if there is, in fact, something else. So I thought that was the only real interesting thing about this. I thought that everything else was pretty meh or shit, and we'll get into that stuff. Now, the meh concept that I have for you as an example is like the scoundrel/greedy lead character, in this case Rachel, who gets more than they bargained for after they were, like, you know, charging forward, looking for that, you know, the biggest heist of their life or whatever. I thought that was like, that's a pretty played out concept, but in the context of a StarCraft custom campaign, we haven't really seen that too much. And it contrasted, I think, or could have contrasted well with the idea of like the more clandestine, organized UED. Then you have this sort of fish out of water scenario, or easily could be a fish out of water scenario, with the scoundrel, the thief, the scavenger that is just trying to make a quick buck and doesn't really care, like, morally ambiguous, you know, can be convinced to join either side of a conflict with more complex entities around. You know, they're a bit more simple, a bit easier to, you know, sort of put yourself on and sympathize with, because everybody can sympathize with the idea. At least they can understand the idea of, or relate to the idea of, like, a character that is just sitting there waiting for some money, looking for some money, trying to earn some money, and it doesn't really matter if it's you know, sort of, again, morally or ethically, but, you know, at the very least dubious, but potentially bankrupt even. And so we can at least understand that, even if we don't directly relate to that kind of character archetype. And so I thought that was a more, that as a concept was easier to relate to than like this UED stuff that it seemed deliberately designed to be more out there and more extreme. And so you can like balance the two by having a really obviously relatable character archetype, in this case the scavenger, scoundrel, whatever, and then you sort of contrast that against the more out there UED Captain Fika experimenting on people and Zerg and Protoss and all this other stuff. You know, it was a way to have some sort of grounding force. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't really played up in execution, and obviously the characterization of Rachel was very weird. It was like, you know, there were some times that, and especially in the early stages, that Rachel as a character was reinforced with their dialogue as just being after that paycheck. But afterwards, it just became repetitive, and she never really adjusted the dialogue, really, or the tone of her transmissions was never adjusted to the stakes that were really, like, the stuff that was actually at stake in the campaign, where you're fighting against hordes of Nightmare Zerg, you know, things that evidently even the UED themselves are afraid of, yet Rachel really rarely bats an eye at them. And so I felt that was pretty inconsistent characterization in that particular realm, or just at the very least it was like very flat characterization. Something that I definitely would have preferred to see differently is having her be a bit more human and be a bit more relatable in that scenario, instead of just being a scoundrel and a scavenger, greedy, and not being any more complicated than that. Because you'd think that even somebody who is greedy, who is after that paycheck, would still have some doubts over this whole scenario. Instead, she was just like, well, I'm definitely doing this no matter what, and so the only real dilemma here is, do I side with the UED or do I side with Stephen Kane? And even then, that was mostly slanted towards the UED in all of the dialogue. So there really wasn't that much room for her to be more complex, I guess. And so even though it's an okay to meh concept in general, very played out concept, you still could have had that work out. It's just that the execution was pretty bad. Now, the really awful execution of the other concepts would be like, the Protoss technology and Zerg experiments are, I say that it's awful execution mostly because it's not really touched. It's just written off as like a hand wave away for an excuse to have this new technology. And these are pretty big deals in the story in terms of their impact to the narrative, like what they actually represent and how they're characterized through the gameplay, like as a storytelling tool, how the gameplay characterizes them. And so you'd think that there would be more of an effort to explain not necessarily the science behind how they came into being, but the motivations for the UED to do that. And you can say that it's just as simple as them wanting more military strength. But again, that goes back to the whole idea of Captain Fika himself not ever having any motivations, not ever having any proper motivations for why to do these experiments to begin with, why to have captured Protoss like the High Templar in Map 8 that felt very shoehorned in. Why have any of this stuff? And then why also, not only why do you have any of that, but once you establish why you've had any of that going on in the background, also establish like what Fika's motivations are to use these. Like what is he going to use these for? What is the UED at large? What is their ultimate goal here? It's not just to have more military strength, but what do they need that more military strength for? And so since neither of these things are ever established, this really just falls flat for me. And it's just like an excuse to a very hand wavy surface level excuse to have stronger Protoss or stronger Terran units, I guess, and stronger Zerg units. And so as a result, I didn't really feel like that was woven in, I guess, to the storyline in that respect. The bigger issue, I think, is probably the duplicitous antagonist in Stephen Kane, who the big reveal is that he's actually Captain Fika the whole time. And the fact that he was posing as somebody else, it's not set up at all. And when you have a twist that's that big, I think you need more. There's obviously like some idea of like, oh, Stephen Kane's acting very strangely, right? He's like, I'll be waiting in the command center, always waiting in the briefing of Map 8. And then he has some other stuff that he says throughout the campaign that just comes across as very psychotic almost, like very strange dialogue to have. And it's very obvious that he was presented this way because Tipereth, there was going to be some sort of twist at the end, right? Like Tipereth wanted to leave these little breadcrumbs that leads you to believe, at the very least, it very clearly communicates that Stephen Kane is not all the way there, like not all there, not all himself. Now, the problem with this is that we don't know who Stephen Kane is, realistically speaking. We don't really get a whole lot of characterization as to who Stephen Kane is before we have the reveal of, that it was, Fika the whole time. And so even though we play, I think, 2 missions from Kane's perspective, at least, there's pretty big issue with the fact that after that, Fika's revealed to be Kane the whole time in terms of like the modern day story with Rachel. There's not really enough of a difference in Fika's Kane interpretation or like how Fika pretends to be Kane, that Kane and the Kane of the past who killed the hallucination of Fika in the end of Map 7. And so since there's not enough of a difference between those two characters, it doesn't actually feel like there's that much of a twist that, oh, Fika was actually Kane, because it doesn't feel like the character A was actually character B. It just feels like, oh, that guy that's wasn't really that much of a character to begin with is also is actually this character who also wasn't that much of a character to begin with, because we don't get enough characterization of Fika. We don't know what his motives are. We don't really know anything about him. And we also don't really know any of the same stuff about Kane. It's a little bit easier to understand his motivations for sicking the Thunderchild onto the facility and apparently detonating it. That was another thing that I thought was a weird plot hole, because it Yamato'd and destroyed itself, I guess. Like it sacrificed itself, the Thunderchild that is, to blow open the facility in Mission 6. But then you had, they were saying, oh, we got to get to the Thunderchild. And I thought that the Thunderchild was actually going to be there at some point, but it's just glossed over the fact that I guess it was just blown up and completely gone. Like there was no remains of it or anything. And I thought that was a little strange. And so, definitely not a fan of that overall. Now, when it comes to the whole Fika Kane thing, I still feel like Kane and Fika both should have been established as distinct characters, so that there would have been, and then of course, Fika's Kane interpretation should have had more in common with Fika than it had in common with Kane, so that we knew that there was something up, and then afterwards it would make a little bit more sense when we go back and we refactor the early the present day missions with Rachel, where her interactions with Kane sound more like interactions with Fika. If you just take the nameplates off and you remove the portraits, you just read the lines. Oh, that sounds like a Fika line more than a Kane line, right? And that would be your first thought when you go back and reread it, I guess, re-experience it. It makes more sense in that way. Well, it doesn't make more sense in the current draft, and that's like a big problem because that's like the primary twist, the big moment, as I described it in Mission 8. That is, or Mission 7, I guess. That is the big moment. And I'm not really I'm not a big fan of that whole, just the way that it was executed. So I thought that was pretty shit execution overall. Now, I think we can talk about gameplay now. It's been 20 minutes of story, so we'll talk about gameplay, try to wrap this up relatively smoothly. And thankfully, there's not really that much to talk about for gameplay. I say thankfully, obviously I'm sarcastic. There was basically no focus on the gameplay. Essentially, the way that I like to describe the gameplay of Echoes is that it forces you to wait around. It forces you to do these like very menial tasks, and it really is just ancillary to the story itself. It's very much an experience where you'll play the game and you'll feel like you're waiting for the actual gameplay to kick in, and it never kicks in. You're never really playing the game. It's always just basic shit and very, very surface level of no substance. The modded units don't help either because a lot of them are broken, and it's to the point of removing skill expression. A lot of it is random, RNG, and it'll trivialize some encounters, like I'm thinking the Goliaths when they're attacking air units in Mission 5. Constructive interference. Glad I wrote down the fucking mission names. So Mission 5 has, this scene where you can get, if you destroy, I think it's hives, you get free Goliaths from the UED, and they're Aurora Goliaths, and they shoot these massive AoE, like attack target 3x3 phase disruptors or something like that for the Dragoon projectiles. And they absolutely eviscerate all air units, including the heroic air units. And of course they do this at a crazy range. And so this completely trivializes any encounters with air units. There's no way that, like, even the Nightmare Guardians couldn't hold a candle to these things. And so that's a pretty big fucking deal. And that trivializes all anti-air encounters for the rest of it. The Nidhogg bombers trivialize everything on the ground. And so those are both in the same mission. And in other cases, it'll force you to cheese other encounters when you're fighting against the Nightmare units, or it'll make it so that there's really no good answer, like fighting Nightmare Hydras. You just have to hope that the RNG, works in your favor, basically. And so that there's a pretty big issue with that, I would say. And so when you have these modded units, they are definitely not operating in a sense that they are adding skill expression to the game. They are removing skill expression. They're making it harder for you to express your skill as a better player than the average, as a worse player than the average. So it really makes it a lot harder to see, when somebody is using these units correctly, when somebody is taking fights better, because the units themselves don't behave in ways that reward skill. They just sort of reward you randomly for using them at all. So obviously really bad design there. And of course, the missions themselves were very, very basic. It was like microing units, a lot of micro missions. Like I said, I think it's 7 out of 9 maps were micro. I don't really know if you even count the 9th mission because it was like a credits map, really. The A moving was a side note. So yeah, overall, I would say that the gameplay was notably like a really lacking part of this. And as it's a campaign, it's a game, right? It's content for a game. You want the gameplay to be the biggest thing about the entire production. And so that was something that really put me off. Now, when we're talking about, specifics, I'll get into the specifics. I already talked about constructive interference. The only mission is the easiest mission to make passable. I talked about this in my post-play for Map 9. It's Mission 3, Signal to Noise. This mission was the first macro mission of the only 2 that we got. And it's the easiest mission to make passable because of the fact that it has AI, it has enemy AI, has a couple of bases. So you would remove a lot of the starting resources or make it so that there's less of a stockpile in those resources. So like it's 750 minerals instead of 1500 per patch. And then you would make it so that there's less stockpiled in all of the other expansions and maybe add a couple of additional expansions. And then it suddenly, expanding is more important. Taking map control away from the Zerg is more important, and of course you would improve the AI. And then you'd probably remove the Easter egg hunt part and just make it so that the AI used the Nightmare Zerg units. And of course I would fix all of the Nightmare units to actually reward skill and make it so that there was some sort of telegraphed, gameplay read for when they were going to do their little AoE bullshit, like the Plague Hydras and stuff. I would figure out a way to make it so that it was more about skill, more about positioning, all that stuff. And so aside from the mod related issues, if you just look at it as a build and destroy mission without any mod changes at all, or like just with the mod changes for the hero, you could still make that a really passable mission, a very basic average mission if you just made it so that it's a destroy enemy productions, a destroy enemy hatcheries mission, and you make the AI expand heavily, but start out with not so much. But if you leave them to expand, then obviously they will mine out all the resources and you won't have any to complete the mission with. So, then it's a more macro-oriented, more action-oriented, pretty fast-paced mission. I would say you'd probably finish in about 15 to 20 minutes. So it's a pretty serviceable map. Probably not great, obviously, but still something. And I did find out by somebody who opened the map, somebody I posted it on my Discord server, they said that the tech was all in the top left corner. So that's why we never found any like spawning pools or hydrodens or anything like that. Or if we did, it wasn't the last of them. And so they were still, sending out, hydras and zerglings and stuff really late in after we destroyed most of their base areas. It's not, they weren't anywhere on the map. They were all in the top left-hand corner on high ground. So pretty embarrassing. Could have scanned that and found that. That would have been funny. So, the ship missions, just like I was talking about, concepts and executions in the story, the ship missions were basically all the rest of them. Like I said, I talked about constructive interference with regards to how trivializing the new units made them. Made in various encounters. The crashes in that mission were pretty fucking pervasive, and the fact that the map maker, Tipereth, didn't actually take the time to debug the crashes, to get somebody to debug them for them. I mean, tools existed to do this. Ollie Debug's been around for a long time. Even I can figure out how to do this stuff, and I suck at coding. So you'd think that somebody would have been able to step in and help this guy out, especially if he asked. It just doesn't feel like there was much effort put into it, and this goes back into the idea that, again, this was like a rush job for a contest that was never updated afterwards. So that's pretty embarrassing. And then I think it's noteworthy how poor the gameplay communication was in most of the missions, but particularly map 6, 7, and 8 had really bad gameplay communication. Map 6, for those unaware, I don't remember the mission title, but it's the one where it might be Farewell to Ithaca or something. It's the one where you are playing as Stephen Kane, and there's about 6 paragraphs of text that explain all of the mechanics that goes by at crazy speeds. So that's pretty psychotic. And then, of course, we remember the Easter egg hunts from Mission 3, Signal to Noise, from Mission 2, I don't remember the name, and really poor boss battle design overall, Mission 8, Mission 2. I think those were really the only two that stood out to me. That might have been the only two that had boss battles at all, for all I remember. Oh, no, I guess there was the Zephyr tank in Mission 7. That was also pretty fucking horrible. So, there you go. That was the review for Echoes. My final thoughts. There's really nothing of real substance to talk about in this campaign. We can infer a lack of vision from the end product. We can infer a lack of dedication from the absence of post-release updates to fix bugs and crashes. And as far as whether or not I would recommend this campaign, only for developers who want an example of a quote-unquote ambitious story gone horribly wrong. And so that is where we will leave our thoughts on Echoes. Thank you very much for joining me for the production. Make sure you check out the playlist for DF's amazing Zerg here video, and I will see you guys in the next review or video or whatever you happen to click on next on my channel.